Hello again, thanks for choosing us. For months, it dominated the headlines, further deepened the animosity in Parliament and generated controversy amidst a downgrade of Ghana's credit ratings. The finance minister warned we will perish if the narrative continues. But after that dramatic passage of what was touted to be the panacea to this ailing economy, we are learning today that the E-Levy is not doing so well. Deputy Finance Minister Dr. John Kuma gave a hint 2 weeks ago in an interview with my colleague George Wiafe.
The expected revenues are not being met as of now, but at least we thank God that we have been able to introduce a tax handle that is also going to contribute to the revenue mobilization of our country in the long term. So one of the key financial anchors of the U-Start is going to be the revenues from the E-Levy.
I asked this question about how is it doing because the success of this initiative also will be critical on the E-Levy. And I remember 2 or 3 months ago, even 6 months ago, we had a discussion last studio, and you pointed to us that you've done your research and you talked about how there will be some attrition rates and all the rest. Per the projections that you did, and you always work out the numbers monthly, what will come in and all the rest. Are we meeting that target or is slightly behind?
Slightly behind, but we are on course. We believe that, and at the moment we are still not on the common platform for all the stakeholders who collect, the E-Levy to be on at real time. So obviously we'll still have some down times. But I believe from July, when all the telcos and all the stakeholders who are supposed to collect, the banks and everybody are on one platform, under the supervision of the GRA, and we can know in real time. So we're going to see a lot of improvement.
But today, a close associate to the president, Gabi Asare-Ochidako, has put figures to what the deputy finance minister, John Kuma, said in that interview with my colleague, George Wiafe. He posted on his Twitter handle, what options are open to government? The question should rather be, what option, if adopted, will re-inject investor confidence in our economy? Even if we find the $3 to $5 billion required, will that help? E-Levy, which was to have given us some 600 million by now, has done less than 60 million. So that's Gabi on the E-Levy. He then throws in the thorny issue of an IMF program, and you see his tweets there. The first tweet, am I against an IMF program in principle? He answers that question himself by saying no. He then goes on to say, I am not for an IMF program that throws peanut at us, but imposes conditions that will end up hurting the poor, jobs and businesses more. COVID-19 and war in Ukraine are not of Africa's doing, but more to our doom. A program that pretends it is all our doing is doomed to fail. And then Gabi continues to say that we do something that will inject confidence in our capacity to ride this heavy storm, and that something should happen pretty quickly. Are you against an IMF program? So this is what has generated this controversy and the conversation about Ghana heading to the IMF now or later. Well, earlier, the finance minister spoke at a town hall in Tamale, responding to suggestions that Ghana should head to the IMF, and said government categorically will not go to the IMF no matter what. But 2 weeks ago, in that PM Express interview you watched with my colleague George Wiafe, the Deputy Finance Minister, Dr. John Kuma, said government will go if the internal measures do not work. So at this point, the question is, are we ripe for an IMF program? Kofi J is a data analyst with our research desk and joins me in the studio to do some comparative analysis on the indicators that compelled government to go to the IMF in 2015, you remember, under the NDC government, and what the figures are looking like today. Kofi, walk us through the figures.
Right, Ede. So in 2015, before we entered the IMF program, these things were panning out. So first one, there was a widening current deficit or the budget deficit then in 2015. There was also, rising inflation, depreciation of the cedi. There was also large civil service salaries back then in 2015. and we also had falling commodity, prices. So our gold, our cocoa, and then our crude oil that we're selling on the international market all had their prices, falling back then in 2015. And also we had, the famous doomsaw in 2015, the power crisis that we had that hit our energy sector in 2015. All those were some of the background stories we can add to it when we look at the indicators which were prevailing the time that we went to the IMF in 2015. Now, I want us to do some comparative analysis. So we are comparing 2015 when we signed up for the IMF program and 2022. What is the situation? Is there any difference between these two, periods that we are talking about? So let's first look at exchange rates back then. So as of May 2015, when we had gone to the IMF barely a month, the CD had lost 19.9% against the dollar. What do we know now? The CD currently, as of May 2022, has lost 15.8% against the United States dollar. We can also talk about inflation in May. In May 2015, inflation was at 16.9%. This year, 27.6%. Almost the 16.9 figure we saw back then in 2015 when we went to the IMF has doubled, and currently we are seeing an inflation of 27.6% in 2020. We also took a look at what we call the gross international reserve. It is very, very important if you want to measure, a country's situation when it comes to it being at crisis or it being in crisis. And so when you talk about gross international reserve, by April 2015, we were doing somewhere around 4.8 billion Ghana cedis, which was earning us somewhere 3.3 months of imports covered then. It means that the international reserve that we had could afford us almost a little above 3 months of importation. Yeah, exactly, which is most of it foreign currency driven. Now, what do we know this year? The figure has actually, in monetary terms, it has risen from the 4.8 billion Ghana cedis to 8.3 billion cedis. But that's not the measure we are looking at. We are looking at how many months of imports cover can you do with this international reserve that we are talking about? 3.7 months of imports cover, which is somewhat close to what we had then in 2015 when we were doing the 3.3. Another one is the famous debt to GDP ratio. Then in 2016 was 66.5%. That was somewhere in March. This year by March we're doing 78%. Tax to GDP ratio was 4.2%. Cumulatively, that was from January 2015 to March 2015. Tax to GDP ratio was 4.2%, and this year it has actually reduced to 2.6% in 2022.
And I'm interested in that very last indicator, exactly. The first quarter GDP growth rate. Tell us about it. That's
another very good measure when you want to look at some of these indicators. Back then in 2015 was 10.8%. That was a huge figure then for us, a huge growth for us, very good, 10.8%. But there were other underlying factors, just like we spoke about the energy sector crisis, we spoke about the widening deficit and all those things. But the economy managed to grow in the first quarter of 2015 by 10.8%. This year, 3.3%. We've had COVID, obviously, and then the Russia-Ukraine tension this year. Now, I want us to also look at what government actually did in 2015 when it signed up for the IMF program. So, number one, it had to limit, hiring of workers and also decrease what we call wages. And then it also had to eliminate subsidies for utilities and petroleum products. So, imagine, Ernest, if we sign up for an IMF program and then the price of petrol keeps increasing, governments cannot come in to subsidize. The government cannot come in to say that I am taking away 5 taxes. That would be very difficult for the government to do.
This was the condition as at 2015.
Exactly, 2015.
We are not sure if we'll get similar conditions should we head to the
probably
today.
It's obvious,
because of how things are playing on the world markets.
We actually will need it if we because we need the revenue. Then you can't touch any cedi in the economy when we look at you sign off an IMF program. They also introduced tax handles in 2015 when we signed up for the IMF program. So we had the famous luxury tax on cars. Then also those who were earning very high amounts were also being taxed.
Yeah.
In 2015. We also look at the famous sinking fund also introduced in 2015, which was to help us pay off our long-term bonds using excess proceeds from the oil revenues, or what we call the stabilization fund. Then the last table that I want us to look at, Ernest, here is our current situation as a country. We have projected to get a tax revenue of 80.2 billion Ghana cedis. So the last time I checked from the Finance Ministry's own fiscal data, the first quarter of 2022, we've been able to do only 12.9 billion cedis currently. And these are the line items, what we are getting from. Obviously, we are not getting anything from E-Levy in the first quarter because it wasn't applicable here. E-Levy has been revised to 4.5%. So this is the picture for Ghana.
Not looking so good.
It's one of the key indicators. These are our projections. And these are what we've gotten so far in the first quarter of 2022. Provisional though, but it actually gives you a picture.
Kofi, thank you very much, as always, for bringing us those figures and helping put the conversation in perspective. Let's go to Zoom now and speak to an economist, Dr. Patrick Sumin. He is with the University of Ghana Business School. Thank you very much, sir, for your time here on Joy News Prime. So the question is, we are not doing well as far as revenue mobilization is concerned. We're banking our hopes so much on E-Levy. Unfortunately, it's not raking in enough for us so far. Should we be looking at an alternative? And the question is the IMF the solution?
Well, good evening, and good evening to viewers. So for me, it's not a surprise that we are not raising as much from the E-Levy as the government projected. I think at the time the levy was announced, many economists, like myself, said that the government is underestimating how sensitive customers will be to the tax. Even though we haven't seen official numbers yet, but I mean, we've seen the research from Imani, and it appears that people in the know in government are already revealing that the levy was not going to give us as much as we projected. So it's clear that the E-Levy is not the solution. It was said, but the government was adamant. Some might say that it's still a little too early in the day to say, but what we know for sure is that the government is certainly not going to raise as much revenue as it thought it would raise from the E-Levy. Then the question is alternatives. We have to understand that the E-Levy is not the only tax measure or revenue measure that the government announced in the budget. It initially said it was going to scrap the benchmark values.
Yeah.
And then it spoke about the, reintroducing the exemption bill. And then there's also a discussion about property taxes. So there are other avenues to make additional revenue. But it appears that the government is dilly-dallying so much. At least let's start with the benchmark values. Today is going, tomorrow is not going. So I think that there's a problem with that.
Yeah.
And in March, when the finance minister spoke about the additional measures, he said that they are going to start action on the property taxes by the end of May or so. We are waiting to see what exactly has happened. And then also what has happened with the exemptions. It's interesting that you speak about the IMF, because the discussion about exemptions started way back when we were in the IMF program. And it has been in our discussion, our budgets persistently. Only God knows why action has not been taken. The government, the president has spoken about it. How much?
Doc, you're referring to tax exemptions?
Yes, tax exemptions.
Okay.
The president has spoken about how much is bleeding the tax bracket.
Yeah.
Nothing has been done. Every year we speak about this, and yet action is not being taken. So we hope that next month, when the finance minister comes to speak to us about in the mid-year budget, he will tell us that finally something concrete is being done on the other revenue measures. In terms of whether IMF is the alternative, well, from where I sit, the IMF is not the solution to the country's long-term problems. It isn't.
Okay.
If you look at the problems that this country is facing, primarily is because we have a structure of an economy that makes us so susceptible to any external shock. Any event that happens in global economy, because of the structure of our economy, we are import dependent. We import even things that we should be producing locally. And we have and agriculture, we have an export structure where we export raw materials and import finished goods. So because of that, every time there's any shock, it's going to affect our currency and it's going to affect how the economy is doing. So that is the major long-term problem.
Very well.
Then we have also problem with government finances, where the government is not able to raise enough revenue and we are spending so much. Now, what an IMF program would do is probably, generally, IMF solutions will help you with your short-term financing as well as with the currency.
Okay.
The IMF is not going to solve our long-term problems. In any case, I think that even the issue with fixing the currency and fixing government finances, it appears that the Ghanaian economy has developed resistance to IMF prescriptions. Because we were only recently in an IMF program, and we've come out, and guess what? Some of the things that we promised we would do under the program, we didn't do it. So for me, going back to the IMF is not the long-term solution. But it also looks inevitable that that's where we are headed, because the government has refused to do the things that we need to do in order not to go back to the IMF.
Well, Doc, thank you so much. And government has been speaking to it again. We hope that this will bring some clarity and maybe a finality to this issue, because the Minister for Information, Kojo Nkrumah, has revealed that the Finance Minister has not created the impression that Ghana needs to go to the IMF for help. In an exclusive interview, Kojo Nkrumah revealed that the Minister will present data on the economy later on the decision whether to go to the IMF or not. He spoke to my colleague, Kojo Brace.
Had discussions around IMF. Some say let's go, some say we won't go. But if you look at the reality on the table now, how difficult things are, when are we going to the IMF?
So two things. One, this is not the first time somebody has suggested we should go to the fund for support to deal with the fiscal challenges that we have. I think every now and then you hear somebody make that kind of recommendation. The fund is one, or a fund program is one of the instruments that many governments sometimes resort to when they have fiscal policy challenges. So it's understandable that some people may make that argument. But the person responsible for fiscal policy in this country has been quite clear that he believes that there are clear domestic measures that can answer the same questions for us. I take him at his word. We are additionally going through a process of assessment of the data. You have to come to Parliament with the fiscal outturn for the first half of the year, or maybe ending at the first quarter, and tell us consequently what the fiscal program for the rest of the year is. And I'm sure when he does get to that time, he'll provide us with all the data and the justification for whatever decisions that he's urging on the Republic.
But if it turns out that we have to?
Like I've said, you are at a time when we are all clear in our minds that we have fiscal challenges because of what happened in 2020 when COVID hit us, and what has happened in early 2021 as a result of the global economic difficulties. When you are watching all the screens in your newsroom, you see what's happening in the UK and the US and everywhere else. So that is a given, it's not news. What is the solution? Does the system that manages fiscal policy have domestic answers on the revenue side, on the debt management side, on the forex side, on the expenditure control side, to deal with the challenges? If they do, and like they have explained they do, they'll put it on the table. That will not stop other people from suggesting that they think that a fund program may be preferable. It's a democracy. That's why people raise their various views. So let them come up, but let us be guided by the hard data when it gets to the middle of July, and we're having to put that data out and take a decision.
Inflation is also getting out of hand. What is that big plan of government to keep it in check?
You know, I said today the assessments started. In March, government was the first to signal that looking at what was happening in the Black Sea area, we were most likely going to be very heavily hit because fuel and food will be affected, and financing because of the measures that were being introduced by the EU, etc., will also be affected. The impact on us includes things like high levels of inflation. So you see many countries that are having high levels of inflation, and Ghana is also having high levels of inflation. Today when we met with the market women and the transport operators, a good chunk of their data corresponds with the data from the Statistical Service. The fuel prices translating into high transport prices are causing high food prices, And many other players in the economy are also therefore increasing their prices because they are saying that a good chunk of disposable income that goes to fuel and food is being consumed. What we need to do is to find ways by which we can mitigate or arrest things like food price increases or the transportation of food items. Because on the underlying fuel side, you have very limited options. So if food output is high, but the prices are high because food inputs, fertilizers because of Russia and Ukraine, and agro inputs because of exchange rate, and again Russia and Ukraine are high, can you introduce any mitigating measures there to control the food input prices so that when you still have output, the price is not high? Can you control smuggling or export of some of the grains that you've succeeded in producing high qualities? On the transportation side, can you do anything about transportation? Today, the data we're looking at shows that some of the items may be very affordable at the farm gate, but as it makes its way through the value chain to the markets down south, the prices go up. These are the places where your interventions ought to go, and they are the places that government is seriously considering whether or not it can do something beyond what it has done already.
Which means that there's no decision yet taken, but we are looking for what government is doing to take us out of the situation we are.
But I've told you already that in March we introduced measures. April, May, June, we are only 3 months from then. We are going through an assessment period, and then we'll feed the outcome of all of that assessment into the mid-year review. That is the time that you expect a second batch of decisions possibly to be made.